Ladies and gentlemen, comrades and others, it is with great pleasure and honor that I appear before you today to deliver the keynote speech on this rather important conference. First, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me, as well as my brother Eben, to give a southern perspective, basically, to the discussions that we're going to be having today, and to engage us in the process of global education in the North. I will start by sharing a bit of my personal story now. That's not because I'm fond of talking about myself, but because I would like to make you understand more where I will be coming from during the rest of the presentation. I was born in Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe was at that time a British colony, which was called Rhodesia. A small white European minority ruled over millions of Africans at that time with an iron fist. There was racial discrimination in all aspects of life. You know, for instance, you couldn't attend schools that you wanted to attend as an African. There was no intermarriages. So basically, there was a life for the Africans and a life for the white Europeans. The African was dehumanized and reduced to less than an equal. The land and property of the Africans was brutally confiscated, and Africans were transferred into so-called tribal trust lands. Before that, they were called reserves. I think you might be aware that in the United States today, there are also so-called Indian reserves. So these are basically areas that are specifically meant to keep that time the Africans inside. I grew up in a period during which Zimbabweans were waging a war of liberation, and this was called Chimurenga, the second Chimurenga. This is because Africans, at least in Zimbabwe, never accepted the state of affairs and struggled to overthrow the system that basically suppressed them. So this war was brutal and saw tens of thousands of people, mainly civilians, killed. Many of my relatives were also killed in this war. I went to some of the best schools, I'm talking about primary and secondary schools in Zimbabwe, that were reserved for Africans. Like I said before, there were schools that were reserved for Africans and those that were reserved for Europeans. Education was segregated, the same as healthcare, social services, sports, and all aspects of life. Only a fraction of Africans, though, actually managed to enter the schools which I'm talking about, and an even smaller percentage to actually complete the studies. I remember when I finished primary education, I think there were about 3 or 4 of us managed to go to secondary school out of about 30 people. And then even in secondary school, every second year there were exams that were extremely selective. So the idea was actually to really get just a very, very, very small fraction of people to actually get to university. So the educational system, I'm still talking about colonial Zimbabwe, taught us that we were inferior to Europeans and that we basically had no history worth studying, and that our greatest sites were discovered by Europeans. Examples are, let's say, the so-called Victoria Falls, we call them Osiatunya. We were taught that they were discovered by Dr. David Livingstone, but we know that actually Dr. David Livingstone was taken there by Africans on his back and shown these falls as an interesting site. This we found, of course, we do find to be pretty Eurocentristic, because if you say that he discovered the Victoria Falls, what you're saying is basically that the falls were not existent before he went there. but I think it would be more appropriate to say that he discovered them for the Europeans, or he is the first European to see them, or something like that. And when I came to Slovenia to study, I was of the impression that the bad guys came from the West. Now I'm talking in the perspective of colonialism, the United Kingdom, France, and all the other countries that had colonized us. And that the eastern part of Europe was actually full of the good guys who were welcoming Africans. To be honest, I have very fond memories of my arrival to Slovenia and my stay in Slovenia, and I still do. After all, I have 3 very beautiful daughters in Slovenia with a Slovene. But the reality is that there was also quite a shock, at least on my part, when I found out that there was racism in Slovenia as well. However, this motivated me to learn more about the realities of peoples in Slovenia, to try and understand how, where this was coming from. To try and build a gap and understanding between the peoples I related to in Slovenia and those I related to in my native Zimbabwe or the African continent at large. So we did this as an African diaspora through awareness-raising campaigns and cultural events, etc., etc. So basically, what we're trying to do was show the Slovenian populace that there was a different kind of life in Africa, amongst Africans, than they were being taught, and we used multiple methods for this. I remember that time, actually, it was not uncommon to be asked stupid questions like, well, do you live in trees and stuff? So we really had a lot of work, which we thought that time was important for us to do. Not out of any vengeance, but because we thought it was our duty actually to do the little we can to help people enlighten themselves. Since then, in my quest for knowledge to better understand the relationships, I'm talking about the relationships between Slovenia and Africans, Slovenians and Africans, I discovered that Slovenians had also been involved in the enslavement of Africans and were informed, like all of us, by the so-called colonial library. Now, this is a set of representations and texts that have collectively invented, in brackets, Africa as a locus of difference and alterity. These are texts that have constructed the Africans' knowledge of themselves, according to Professor Mudimbe, a Congolese, who coined the term. So basically what this means is that there is a body of knowledge out there that started a long time ago that is being used to inform everybody. No one is excluded in this room and elsewhere. That gives us this impression that things are worse in Africa than they really are, and better in Europe than they really are, to put it very simply. But the average Slovenian that time did not know these things. Furthermore, the portrayal of Africans in the media is just as negative, shallow, and superficial as anywhere else I know about in Europe. School literature is often pretty Eurocentric, and in its portrayal of Africans. So I went on to found an institute called the Institute for Global Education, precisely to look more into these issues. So now, when you talk about the global south, 80% of the world's population live in the global south. If global education aims at changing the world for a better place, fighting poverty and injustice, then surely the south, the global south, being the place that apparently is most hit by poverty, should have a say in how global education is done all over. aim being to demonstrate to try and come up with a more balanced view of the realities of Africa and Africans. It is through our work in this field that we actually got involved in this project, the North-South School Partnerships. In this project, like Judith already said, our approach was to integrate the Southern perspective, where Southern partners are not just bystanders or welcome guests to the project, but actually have an equal say in the way the project is manifested. In such a partnership, all stakeholders can learn with and from each other in order to transform their respective communities and reflect on the way they relate to one another. And I really believe that this is the way forward. So let me conclude by again quoting Paulo Freire. He says, "I'm not concerned about critical thinking," which is one of the important facets of global education. So I'm not concerned about critical thinking as a skill, but critical consciousness as a way of getting kids to understand themselves, their relationships to others, and what it means to actively change the world. So this, ladies and gentlemen, can only be achieved if the truth be told, no matter how harsh it may seem. Understanding our past will serve us all to better deal with the present and hopefully understand and better shape the future. I really thank you all for listening.